The road to Ashwell Park had narrowed in her absence, or perhaps Georgiana Vane had simply grown accustomed to broader horizons. The flat, organized streets of Bristol where she had lived these 4 years, the merchant offices where she had kept accounts for Mr. Halcott's import firm with the kind of systematic precision that made his senior clerk uneasy and his margins considerably healthier. The Yorkshire moors pressed in from both sides of the hired carriage, the October sky the color of old pewter, and the hedgerows taller than she remembered, grown unkept and ambitious. Rain had not yet fallen but was making its intentions plain. It sat in the clouds the way debt sits in a ledger, present, organized, waiting. And at the center of all that returning gray, her hands folded over the solicitor's letter in her lap, the wax seal, already broken and reread twice, was Georgiana. She had not planned to come back. She had, in fact, planned the opposite with some specificity. She would write to Mr. Penworth, her father's solicitor, accept whatever modest bequest the will assigned her, and continue her employment in Bristol until something better offered itself. She had been doing real work for Mr. Halcott, balancing quarterly statements, tracking exchange rates, drafting the correspondence that his senior clerk signed without reading, and she had managed to save £43 over 4 years, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, more than most women in her position could claim. But the letter had not described a modest bequest. The letter had described the entirety of Vane Cottage, its 2 tenant farms, the existing lease agreements, and the condition attached to the inheritance, that she reside at or near the estate for a period of no less than 6 months, managing the property in person, before the title could transfer to her name. Her father, it seemed, had thought about her more carefully than he had ever indicated while alive. The condition was very like him, not unkind, but structured. He had always believed that things worth having ought to be worked for rather than handed over. She did not know yet what to make of the other detail in the letter, that Ashwell Park, the great estate that shared the valley with Vane Cottage's modest acreage, had changed hands 8 months prior. The late Duke of Ashwell had died without a direct heir of his body. The title had passed to a cousin from the Welsh branch of the family, a man Georgiana did not know, a man she had not met. The carriage rounded the last bend before the valley opened, and there was Vane Cottage below her, stone and gray slate, the kitchen garden visible even at this distance and visibly neglected, the larger farmhouse beyond it with smoke coming from one chimney. It was smaller than memory had made it. 4 years of absence had given the place a quality it did not actually possess, which was the quality of permanence. She pressed one hand briefly against the window glass and then withdrew it. She had not been sent away from this place. She had left it. That distinction mattered. It had mattered to her at 23, when she had understood clearly that her continued presence in this valley, under the particular social arrangement that had been proposed to her, would require her to become less than she was. She had not been prepared to do that. She was not prepared to do it now. The carriage descended. What had driven her out of this valley 4 years ago was not grief, and it was not failure. It was the particular species of clarity that arrives when a person realizes they have been offered something that looks like a place, but is actually a smaller version of the self. She had packed 2 trunks in a single afternoon and taken the post to Bristol with her father's reluctant blessing and a letter of character he had written in his careful, looping hand. She had found her own work. She had paid her own rent. Now the valley was pulling her back with legal instruments in unseasonable weather, and she was going to manage it the way she managed everything else, methodically, without sentiment, one item at a time. She told herself that the new Duke of Ashwell was an irrelevance. He was a neighbor and nothing more, and she would have as little occasion to encounter him as one had occasion to encounter any neighbor across 400 acres of Yorkshire moorland. She folded the solicitor's letter back into its envelope and put it into her traveling bag. The rain began as the carriage reached the cottage gate, which was, she decided, simply the weather doing what it had always done in Yorkshire. It had no opinion of her arrival. It was rain. She got out of the carriage before the driver could assist her and walked to the door with her bag over her arm. Because she had been letting herself into her own house since she was 12 years old and saw no reason to change the arrangement. The Georgiana who had left this valley at 23 had already been managing Vane Cottage's accounts for 3 years at that point. Her father, Edmund Vane, had been a land agent himself before his health had prevented it. A man of precise habits and genuine education who had taught his daughter to read a balance sheet before she was 10 and had considered this a mark of excellent parenting, which in her view it was. When his hands had begun to fail him in her 20th year, the accounts had quietly transferred to her keeping without ceremony or acknowledgement. She had taken them on the way one takes on any necessary task, completely. The 2 tenant farms, Mallow Farm and the smaller holding the valley people called the Ridge, had between them generated enough income to maintain the cottage and service the modest mortgage her father had taken against the East Field in a year when the wool prices had collapsed. Georgiana had reorganized the accounts in her first quarter of managing them, discovered that her father's system had been conflating 2 separate expense categories for 11 years, and corrected the error with a new ledger she bought herself from the stationer in Harrogate. The correction had revealed an extra £7 annually that had been effectively invisible in the old system. She had applied it to the mortgage. By her second year, she was negotiating directly with the wool merchants, a task that had previously gone through a middleman who charged a commission she calculated at roughly £14 per season for services she could not identify. She had removed the middleman. The merchant had been surprised to find himself dealing with a woman of 21 who arrived with her own figures already written out, but he had adjusted his surprise within approximately 4 minutes, and they had done perfectly adequate business together for the next 2 years. She had also managed the drainage problem on the lower field, which had been reducing Mallow Farm's yield for 6 years. The solution had required letters to the county surveyor, a negotiation with the adjacent landowner about shared responsibility for the ditch maintenance, and the drafting of a written agreement that she had shown to her father's solicitor, Mr. Penworth, before both parties signed it. Mr. Penworth had read the agreement twice before commenting that it was the clearest piece of estate documentation he had seen in 20 years of practice. Georgiana had thanked him and asked if there were any clauses she ought to amend. She had managed the creditor who had appeared one autumn morning with a claim against the estate based on a debt her father claimed not to remember contracting. She had requested the original documentation, examined it, identified that the signature was dated from a period when her father had been confined to bed with influenza, and written a letter to the creditor's solicitor that was civil in tone and technically devastating in content. The claim had been withdrawn within the month. She had done all of this without credit, without title, and without salary. She was a daughter managing her father's affairs. There was no category in the social architecture of rural Yorkshire for what she was actually doing, which was estate management at a level that would have cost a qualified agent considerably more than her cost of zero. There had been in her 3rd year a moment that had tested the machinery of her resolve in a way the creditors and the drainage agreements had not. She had been standing in the upper field on a morning in May, reviewing the boundary markers with the tenant from the Ridge, when Lord Ashwell's land agent, the old Duke's man, a competent enough fellow named Barrow, had ridden out to speak with her about a shared fence line. The conversation had been perfectly ordinary, and then he had said, in a tone that carried no particular malice, that it seemed a waste for a woman of her obvious capabilities to be spending her talents on a property this size, and had she ever considered whether she might not be better placed as a housekeeper, or perhaps as a lady's companion to someone of consequence. He had not intended it as cruelty. That was, in some ways, the worst of it. Georgiana had looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has heard a version of this sentence many times before, and has decided, on each occasion, that it does not constitute information worth absorbing. She had said that she was satisfied with the work she was doing, thanked him for his attention to the fence line question, and indicated that she would have a written proposal regarding the shared maintenance cost on his desk within the week. She had walked back to the cottage, gone directly to the small desk in the morning room, and picked up her accounts. She was not going to become less than she was for the convenience of a world that did not yet have a word for what she was. That had been the decision, made quietly, without drama, in a room that smelled of old paper and Yorkshire stone. It was in her third winter that the proposal had come, not from a man she had chosen, but from one she had not. The younger son of a neighboring family, pleasant enough, genuinely fond of her in the uncomplicated way that pleasant people are fond of competent women, had offered her a life that was, by every measurable criterion, a reasonable one: a house, moderate income, a position in the local community. What he had offered, examined carefully, was the end of being herself in any professional sense. He had said, with the best intentions, that she would no longer need to concern herself with the accounts. She had understood then that the valley had reached the natural boundary of what it could offer her. She had also understood, which was harder, that the Duke's estate, Ashwell Park, visible from her upper field on clear days, its chimneys a permanent feature of her northern horizon, had become something she thought about in ways that were not strictly professional, and that this was a problem she was not going to solve by continuing to exist within its orbit. The young man from the neighboring family had received a gentle and thorough refusal, and 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in February with frost on the windows, Georgiana Vane had packed her 2 trunks, spoken to Mr. Penworth about the management arrangement that would cover the accounts in her absence, left detailed instructions for the tenant at Mallow Farm, and taken the post to Bristol. She had not looked back at the chimneys as the carriage descended the valley road. She had understood, even then, that looking back was not a useful direction. What she had not known, and had not allowed herself to ask, was whether the man she had seen twice from across the annual Ashwell tenants' dinner, not the old Duke, but the old Duke's young neighbor, visiting from London, standing at the edge of the gathering with the particular quality of a person who is present in body and somewhere else entirely in mind, had noticed her the way she had, despite every professional intention, noticed him. His name had been Rhys Caddick then. Now, by the accident of inheritance, it was Rhys Caddick, Duke of Ashwell. She had told herself firmly on the road from Bristol that this was a coincidence and not a sign of anything. It was not a sign. It was a legal instrument and a county boundary, and she was going to treat it exactly that way. Rhys Caddick had inherited Ashwell Park with the particular ambivalence of a man who had never expected it, had not asked for it, and found himself in possession of it the way one finds oneself in possession of a very large, expensive, and structurally complicated house, with 17 tenant farms, and a 40-year-old dispute with the county drainage authority. He had arrived in March. It was now October. He had been, in the intervening 8 months, systematically dismantling the estate's legacy of architectural good taste and managerial bad practice, with the methodical attention of a man who had previously spent 11 years in commercial law and knew what a balance sheet looked like when someone had been helping themselves to it. He had not taken the title willingly. He had taken it because refusing it would have produced a legal complexity that his mother, still alive, resident in the Dowager Cottage on the estate's western edge, fragile in body and formidable in everything else, had made clear would be unconscionable. She had said so in the letter she sent to him in London, in her handwriting that had grown careful and slow since her illness, but had lost none of its precision. He had come north within the week. His mother, Eleanor Caddick, was the reason Ashwell Park had not collapsed into complete disarray in the 8 months since his arrival. Not because she managed it, she was too ill to manage anything by then, but because she had managed it for 30 years before her health had failed, and the estate bore her mark, the way well-built things bear the mark of their maker. He had found her household accounts in the estate office, bundled and annotated in her hand, covering the years from 1798 to 1819, and he had sat with them for an entire evening in the manner of a man reading a letter from someone who could no longer explain themselves. He had grown up knowing his mother was competent. He had not understood, until he sat in that office reading 20 years of estate records, the specific magnitude of what she had managed and the specific invisibility in which she had managed it. The late Duke had received the credit. Eleanor had received the accounts. He had kept those ledgers on the estate office desk, rather than filing them away, which was not efficiency but was something he did not have a better name for. He had hired an investigator in September, not for any dramatic purpose, but because one of the 17 tenant farms was producing numbers that did not match the surveyor's acreage estimates, and he wanted to understand whether this was an error in measurement or an error in reporting. The investigator, a quiet man named Devereaux, had delivered his report in early October. The report had answered his question about the farm and had also included, in its final 3 pages, a set of background notes on the neighboring properties that Devereaux provided as standard practice. The note on Vane Cottage had been brief. Edmund Vane had died in August. His daughter, Georgiana, had been resident in Bristol, employed as accounts supervisor at Halcott & Sons Import. His investigator had noted, with the neutrality of a man who collects facts for their professional utility, that in the period between 1818 and 1822, the Vane estate's financial performance had improved by a documented margin that was difficult to attribute to anyone except the daughter. The drainage agreement with the adjacent landowner, the removal of the wool middleman, the creditor dispute resolution, all of it in the record, if one knew where to look. Rees had read those 3 pages twice, and then set the report down on his desk beside his mother's ledgers. He remembered her. He remembered her with a precision that was not entirely accountable by the 2 occasions on which they had been in the same room. The first had been the tenants' annual dinner in the autumn of 1820, when he had been visiting the old Duke on a legal matter, and had found himself at a long table of farmers and their families, looking for something that was not the performance of polite country society. She had been at the far end of the table, speaking to the tenant from the ridge, and what had fixed her in his memory was not her appearance but the quality of her attention. She had been asking a question, and she had been listening to the answer with the complete, unperformed interest of someone who actually needs the information. He had been close enough to hear her say, without ceremony, that if the Northfield drainage problem persisted through another spring, the solution was almost certainly in the shared ditch maintenance agreement, and had anyone reviewed the original terms recently? The tenant had said that no one had reviewed anything since old Barrow's time, and she had said that she would look into it, and she had meant it in the way that people mean things when they have already decided to do them. He had not spoken to her that evening. He had been on the wrong side of a long table, and there had been no occasion that was not manufactured, and Rees Caddick had never in his life manufactured an occasion for anything. The second time had been a month later, across the distance of a field. He had been riding the boundary of the estate on the old Duke's request, checking the fence line survey, and she had been in the upper field with a notebook and a measuring instrument he did not immediately recognize. She had not looked up. He had not stopped. There had been nothing exchangeable between them, only the fact of his noticing her there, in a field, doing what appeared to be surveying work alone, in November, with complete self-possession. He had taken the post to London 3 days later, and had not returned for 3 years. Now Devereaux's report told him she was coming back to the valley. The will's condition would bring her to Vane Cottage for at minimum 6 months, likely more given the state of the property. which the report described as in need of attention after 4 years of absentee management by a hired factor who had been adequate at best and occasionally less than that. Reese stood at the window of the estate office on the morning of the third day after the report's arrival and considered what he was doing. He was a man of 36 who had spent 11 years in the practice of commercial law, who had been a duke for 8 months with no particular enthusiasm for the title, but considerable thoroughness in its execution, and who was standing at a window on a rainy Yorkshire morning, reading the same paragraph of a surveyor's report, for the 4th time, without processing any of it. He set the report down and went to find his estate steward, Hargreaves, to discuss the Drainage Authority correspondence that had been waiting on his desk for a fortnight. He did not tell himself he was not thinking about the woman 3 miles down the valley road. He simply continued to work, which amounted to the same thing but without the imprecision. He stood outside the closed door of the music room that same evening, because he had heard through it a piece of music that had stopped him in the corridor. Not Georgiana, not yet, she had not arrived, but his mother's hired pianist running through the estate's old sheet music and happening upon a composition he recognized. His mother had played it. He stood in the corridor for approximately 4 minutes and then went back to the estate office. He was there when Georgiana arrived in the valley. He did not know it until the following morning, when his housekeeper, Mrs. Anstey, mentioned over the household accounts review that Vane Cottage had smoke from both chimneys for the first time in recent memory. He said nothing. He continued the review. In the morning, he wrote out the following day on the boundary check he performed weekly and took the southern route, which was longer, and passed within half a mile of Vane Cottage's upper field, and saw no one, and continued his circuit. He told himself this was the boundary check. On the 3rd morning there was a note from Georgiana Vane delivered by the Mallow farm tenant to his estate gate. It was written in a clear, economical hand and addressed to him by his title. It informed him that she had returned to Vane Cottage to comply with her father's inheritance condition, that she intended to manage the property in person for the required period, that she was aware of the existing boundary agreement between their respective estates and intended to honor its terms, and that she wished to arrange a meeting at his convenience to discuss the drainage ditch question, which her review of the existing agreement suggested had not been updated since 1817 and might benefit from revision. Reese read the note at his estate office desk with his morning coffee cooling to the left of him. It was 3 paragraphs. It contained no sentiment, no pleasantry beyond the conventional opening, and a specific legal citation in the final paragraph that was, he checked, accurate. He wrote back within the hour he could meet her at the boundary marker on Thursday at 10 o'clock if that was convenient, and he confirmed the citation was accurate and that revision of the agreement was in his view overdue. She arrived at the boundary marker on Thursday at 4 minutes before 10, which he noted because he had arrived at 3 minutes before 10 and had expected to wait. She was wearing a dark green wool dress that was practical rather than decorative and carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. She looked exactly as he remembered her from the tenants' dinner 7 years ago, which was to say she looked like a person who had arrived somewhere to do actual work and was ready to begin. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy with any elaboration. It was the acknowledgement of a professional meeting its counterpart. "Miss Vane," he said, "I believe we have met, though briefly." "Twice," she said. "The tenants' dinner in 1820, and the boundary survey in November of that year. You were on horseback." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention he usually reserved for contract documents that had just revealed something unexpected. "I was," he said. "I was surveying the Northfield boundary for the drainage agreement negotiation," she said. "I completed it the following week." "Devereux's report mentions it," he said. There was a pause of approximately 2 seconds, during which she processed what that sentence implied about the depth of his preparation for this meeting, and he watched her process it without any expression that could be accurately described as readable. The 1817 agreement assigns maintenance cost equally between the two estates, she said then, opening the portfolio. The current drainage yield suggests that Ashwell's section of the ditch has required substantially more intervention, approximately 60% of the total maintenance work in the period I have records for. I would propose revising the cost-sharing formula to reflect actual use. I have the same figures, he said. My steward prepared an analysis in September. His conclusion was similar. She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating, not with surprise but with the adjustment of a person who has been prepared to argue a case and has just discovered the opposing counsel is already in agreement. Then we are negotiating terms rather than the principle, she said. Yes, he said. I suggest we each take the draft revision to our respective solicitors and reconvene when both parties have reviewed it. That is sensible, she said. They discussed the specific cost-sharing formula for 35 minutes, standing at the boundary marker in October, with the wind coming in off the moor, in the particular manner of Yorkshire wind, which has opinions. By the end of the 35 minutes they had agreed on a formula, a timeline for solicitor review, and a second meeting to finalize the revised agreement. He did not ask about her 4 years in Bristol. She did not offer the information. He did not mention that he had arrived at the boundary marker 3 minutes early. She did not mention that she had arrived at 4 minutes before 10 because she had been there since 9:52 and had been reviewing the revised draft in the portfolio while she waited. She left when the business was concluded. He stayed at the boundary marker for a moment after she had gone, looking at the north field, which had the tidy, organized quality of a field managed by someone who knew what they were doing. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She told herself this on the ride back to Vane Cottage, where the practical domestic work of the morning was waiting. She told herself that Rhys Caddick's preparedness was efficiency, not attention, and that the fact of his having read Devereux's report closely enough to know her name and her drainage agreement was the action of a thorough land manager and not anything more particular. She unpacked her portfolio at the cottage desk and reviewed the draft revision. She made 2 small improvements to the language of the cost-sharing clause and set it aside for Mr. Penworth. Then she opened the Vane Cottage accounts for the first time since her return and began the systematic survey of 4 years' damage. The picture that emerged over 3 days of examination was not catastrophic, but it was close. The hired factor, a man named Greer who had come with a respectable recommendation and departed with the accounts in a state of approximate dismay, had maintained the basic operations of the 2 tenant farms, while systematically neglecting the capital expenditures that kept a property functional over time. The roof of the Mallow farmhouse had needed attention for 2 years and had not received it. The equipment in the north barn was 11 years old when it should have been replaced at the 7-year mark. The lease agreements with both tenants had not been reviewed since 2019 and contained terms that were, by current wool price standards, disadvantageous to all parties in different ways that somehow managed not to benefit anyone. Georgiana worked through it the way she worked through everything, in order, with specific figures, noting each problem and its probable cost, and its urgency on a grid that she drew in the back of her new ledger. By the end of the 3rd day, she had a complete picture. It was not comfortable reading. It was, however, solvable. The arithmetic was straightforward. She needed to renegotiate both lease agreements to terms that would increase annual rental income by approximately £35, enough to fund the immediate repairs and begin the capital maintenance schedule, without making the tenant's situations unviable. She needed to address the Mallow roof before winter set in, which gave her approximately 4 weeks. She needed to find a wool merchant willing to renegotiate the supply agreement, which Greer had renegotiated himself in 2021, in terms she considered an embarrassment to the Vane estate, and possibly to mathematics. She began with the tenants. Thomas Anwick at Mallow Farm was a man of 50 who had farmed the property for 22 years and knew, she was certain, exactly what the current lease terms were worth and what they were not worth. She met him at the farmhouse on a Wednesday morning and laid the accounts on his kitchen table and said that she had been reviewing the arrangement and believed they could do better for both parties. He looked at the figures she had written out for 20 minutes without speaking, then looked at her and said that her father had always said she was the best account reader he'd ever known, and that he supposed they had better start over with the lease. It took 2 meetings and a revised draft that she prepared herself and had Mr. Penworth review, but within 3 weeks she had new lease terms with both tenants, a modest increase in annual rental income for the estate, a set of specific maintenance commitments that shifted the Mallow roof repair to a shared cost, and a clearer schedule for equipment replacement that gave both tenants certainty about what they could expect the estate to fund. The total benefit to the estate's annual operating margin was £41 once the maintenance cost sharing was accounted for. She was making notations on the completed lease revision when she heard the sound of a horse in the cottage yard and found Rhys Caddock at her gate. He was in riding clothes, a dark coat, no elaboration, the same contained quality of presence she had observed at the boundary marker. He said that his solicitor had returned the drainage agreement revision and had raised one concern about the language of the liability clause, and he had thought it simpler to discuss it directly rather than exchange letters. He produced the document from the saddlebag. She considered this for one moment and then said he was welcome to come in, and put the kettle on and sat across from him at the cottage table while he explained the solicitor's objection, which was legitimate, and she suggested a revised clause formulation that addressed the concern without altering the substance of the cost-sharing arrangement, and he read it twice and agreed with it. He did not leave immediately when the business was concluded. He looked at the papers on the table, not intrusively, but with the involuntary attention of a person who cannot help reading what is in front of them, and said, "The Mallow Farm lease revision?" "Completed," she said. "Both tenants signed last Thursday." "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "The accounts required it urgently," she said. "Greer's factor arrangement was—" She paused, selecting the accurate word, "incomplete." "I had a similar experience with my predecessor's estate office," he said. He said it without particular feeling, but she understood the range of what that sentence covered. He had been managing the consequences of negligence for 8 months. She had been managing it for 3 weeks, and it was already a familiar texture. "Your mother's accounts are an exception," she said. It came out before she had decided to say it. She looked at him directly. He was very still. "You have seen them. Mr. Penworth handled some of the boundary documentation in that period," she said. "He spoke of them. He said they were the clearest estate accounting he had reviewed in 20 years of practice." She paused. "He was not wrong, in my experience." Rhys looked at her with an expression she could not read precisely, which was unusual. She could generally read precisely. "She would have been interested to meet you," he said. The past tense landed quietly between them. She did not fill it. She thought about telling him then that she had known, even 7 years ago at the tenants' dinner, that he was someone she would have chosen to talk to in a different world. She did not tell him this. She picked up the drainage revision and said she would have the updated clause to his solicitor by Friday. He took the document and left. She stood at the window and watched him go, and then went back to the accounts, which were, at least, something she could manage. What she could not quite manage in the 3rd and 4th weeks of her return was the particular quality of attention he paid to her, which was not the attention she had been trained to expect from men of his position. It was not admiring or condescending or strategically charming. It was the attention of a person who is genuinely interested in what another person is doing and sees no reason to conceal that interest. He asked her at their second drainage meeting what she had found most challenging about the Greer accounts, and when she described the equipment maintenance problem, he listened in the specific way he had listened at the tenants' dinner 7 years ago, as if what she was saying was actually informative, and he was actually going to use the information. She had explained the maintenance schedule she had devised, and he had asked 2 precise questions about her methodology, and then said that his steward Hargreaves had been developing a similar framework for the Ashwell Farms, and offered to have Hargreaves send her the draft for comparison. Hargreaves had sent the draft the following morning with a brief note in his own hand, saying that the Duke had spoken highly of her work, and that any observations she cared to offer would be genuinely valued. She had observations. She had 6 pages of observations, annotated with references to comparable estate practices she had encountered through Mr. Halcott's network in Bristol, and she sent them back to Hargreaves within 2 days. Hargreaves appeared at her gate 4 days after that, a small, efficient man of 55, with the bearing of someone who had managed large things quietly for a long time. He said he had come on the Duke's behalf to discuss the maintenance scheduling framework, and also, he produced a separate document, that the Duke wished to know whether she had any interest in a consultancy arrangement with the Ashwell Estate Farms, compensated at a professional rate, in which she would review the capital maintenance plans across the 17 properties and provide a formal assessment. The Duke had asked him to specify that this was not charity and not a social arrangement, but a professional engagement, on the basis that her qualifications and track record were demonstrably suited to the task. She stood in the door of the cottage with the document in her hand and read it twice. It was 6 pages long. The compensation rate was generous. The scope was exactly the kind of work she had been doing, invisibly, for 4 years at Vane Cottage and, if she was honest, for 4 years at Halcott's before that. She said she would need to review it with Mr. Penworth before responding. Mr. Penworth read it over the following 2 days. He came to the cottage on a Wednesday morning, a small, careful man of 68 who had been her father's solicitor for 30 years and who had once told her, in a moment of characteristic understatement, that she had more legal instinct than most of the trained solicitors he had dealt with in 3 decades. And he set the document on the table and said that it was a legitimate professional engagement. The terms were fair, the compensation was appropriate, and the Duke's instruction to his steward to specify that it was not charity was, in his view, revealing of a man who had thought carefully about how she would receive it. "He is correct that I would not have accepted it otherwise," she said. "I know," said Mr. Penworth. He paused. "Your father would have found this gratifying." She thought about her father, who had taught her double-entry bookkeeping at the age of 9, and had once told her that the most useful thing a person could possess was the ability to understand where the money actually went. She thought about the fact that he had structured his will not to give her Vane Cottage outright, but to bring her back to this valley for 6 months. And she thought about whether her father had known, in his careful and structured way, more than he had ever said aloud. She signed the engagement document and sent it back with Hargreaves the following morning. The work that followed was the most substantive work she had done in her professional life, and she had not led an unsubstantive professional life. The 17 Ashwell tenant farms varied enormously in their maintenance states and their lease structures. Some of them, she found, had not been formally reviewed since the 1800s and operated on handshake arrangements that were kind to no one and enforceable by no one. She began with a systematic survey, farm by farm, producing a condition assessment for each property that included current maintenance arrears, equipment state, lease term quality, and a priority ranking for intervention. By the 6th week, she had a complete picture of the Ashwell Estate Farm's capital maintenance backlog, which she organized into a 20-page document with appendices for each farm, a total cost projection for the recommended repair schedule over 3 years, and a revised lease framework that she proposed could fund the schedule from within the estate's own margin, rather than requiring external capital, provided the reforms were implemented in the sequence she had specified. She presented it to Hargreaves, who read it in one sitting and then came back the next day and said the Duke wished to meet with her to discuss it in person. She met Rhys Caddick in the Ashwell Park estate office on a Thursday morning in November. It was the first time she had been inside the great house, and she noted the organized quality of the working spaces. This was not a house that had been arranged for show. It had been arranged for use, and recently, and she noted the ledgers on the office desk, which she recognized by their binding as estate accounts from an earlier period, and she understood without asking who had kept them. He offered her a chair across the desk from him, and she sat, and he opened the document to the 4th page, which was the section she had spent the most time on, the case for the East Valley Farm Cluster to be treated as an integrated maintenance unit, rather than 17 individual farms, which would reduce total costs by an estimated 22% over the 3-year period. "Walk me through the methodology," he said. She walked him through it. He asked questions at intervals, precise, specific questions that required precise, specific answers, and she had them, because she had not written anything in the document that she could not defend to the last decimal point. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. At the end of it, he said, "This is the best piece of estate analysis I have seen in 8 months of working with this estate." She said, "I believe it is correct, but your steward should review the cost projections for the larger farms. He has access to the historical repair figures I did not have." "I've already asked him," he said. "He confirms the projections are conservative. The actual savings may be higher." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the estate office window, the November light was doing what November light does in Yorkshire, turning the moors the color of something that has decided to endure the winter rather than resist it. "Miss Vane," he said. There was a quality in his voice that was different from the professional register of the previous 2.5 hours. She recognized the difference the way one recognizes a note played in a different key. Not wrong, but changed. She looked at him. "Your cravat has been crooked since 10 o'clock, she said. "It has been 45 minutes. He looked at her. She was already reaching across the desk, and she stopped herself, and there was a moment that was not uncomfortable but was very still, and then she said, more quietly, "May I?" He said nothing. He simply waited. She leaned forward and straightened the cravat with 2 precise adjustments, and withdrew her hands, and sat back. He had not moved during this process. He said, when she was done, "How long have you been in this valley?" 6 weeks, she said. "I have been in this valley 8 months, he said. "I have a chair in the estate office and a desk that was my mother's, and 17 farms I am responsible for. I have been competent about all of it." He paused. "I have been more competent in the last 6 weeks. The room did not respond to this. It was a quiet room, and it stayed quiet. He said, "I have managed this valley's accounts in one form or another since I was 20 years old. It is not remarkable that I am competent at it." "No," he said. "The competence is not what I am describing." She looked at her hands on the desk, then back at him. "The engagement terms are for 6 months, she said, "and the inheritance condition is for 6 months." "Yes," he said. "Both expire in April." She said she would need the Mallow Farm capital repair documentation by the end of the week for the Phase 1 implementation, and he said it would be ready, and she gathered her papers and left in the organized, unhurried manner with which she did everything, and did not look back at the estate office window, which was not the same as not being aware that he was at it. She had managed 4 years of Bristol. She had managed creditors and drainage ditches and wool merchants and absent factors. She could manage 6 months in a valley with a man who looked at her like she was a problem he was grateful to have found. She told herself this on the road back to Vane Cottage, and then told herself to stop talking to herself and review the Phase 1 repair costings. The opposition arrived in November, as opposition generally does, without announcement and with considerable confidence in its own legitimacy. The occasion was the annual winter gathering of the Ashwell neighborhood's principal families, hosted that year at Hartmere Hall by Sir Geoffrey Aske, who was the senior figure of the local aristocratic circle, a man of 62 who had known 3 Dukes of Ashwell and had opinions about the 4th. Lady Constance Harwick was also present, a woman of 30 who was beautiful in the manner of a well-appointed drawing room, polished and arranged to maximum effect, and who had been, by the understanding of everyone who considered these things, the most probable future Duchess of Ashwell since Rhys Caddock had taken the title. She was the granddaughter of an earl, possessed of a substantial dowry, and entirely suitable by every criterion the social architecture of Yorkshire recognized. She had been attending to Rhys Caddock with the focused warmth of someone who had done their research and reached a conclusion. Georgiana had not been invited to the Hartmere gathering. She had not expected to be. She was there because Hargreaves had suggested it, and Rhys had confirmed it as the professional consultant to the Ashwell estate, present to give a brief account of the capital maintenance assessment to Sir Geoffrey and the other landowners who held adjacent properties, some of whom shared drainage agreements with Ashwell that Georgiana's work had implications for. She arrived in a dark blue wool dress she had acquired in Bristol and wore to professional meetings. She had her portfolio. She knew 3 people in the room: Hargreaves, Mr. Penworth, and Rhys Caddock. Mr. Penworth found her first. He was standing near the window with a glass of wine and the expression of a man who has attended 20 years of these gatherings and formed precise opinions about all of them. He said that Sir Geoffrey had expressed curiosity about the estate analysis, and that Lady Constance had expressed rather less curiosity and rather more of something else which he declined to characterize in terms she would find useful. "I know what I'm here to do," Georgiana said. "I'll do it." She gave the briefing after supper to a circle of 7 or 8 landowners, presenting the capital maintenance framework with the same clarity with which she had presented it to Rhys in the estate office. She had brought copies of the key figures. She answered questions directly and without embellishment, and referred 3 technical drainage questions to Hargreaves, who confirmed her numbers with the equanimity of a man who had checked them himself. Lady Constance said from her seat near the fireplace, in a tone that was pleasant and well-pitched for carrying, that it was remarkable what a thorough job Mr. Halcott's firm had done in preparing such a detailed report, and that the Duke was fortunate to have engaged such capable consultants in London. Georgiana continued to address the question she was answering. When she had finished, she said, without raising her voice, "The analysis was mine, Lady Constance. I prepared it from the estate records directly over 6 weeks on site. I have managed this valley's land accounts for a combined period of 7 years. The maintenance schedule I've proposed should reduce capital repair costs on the Ashwell farms by 22% over 3 years. If anyone would like to review the methodology, I am happy to walk through it page by page." The room was quiet for a moment with the suspended quality of rooms that have just been recalibrated. Sir Geoffrey, to his credit, said that the drainage analysis in the appendix was the most rigorous he had seen applied to this valley's shared infrastructure, and asked if she would be available to meet with his own estate manager in the new year. She said she would. She did not look at Lady Constance again. Lady Constance had not been malicious. She had been the system made articulate, and the system had simply, on this occasion, encountered documentation. She looked at Rhys Caddock across the room, who had been standing at the edge of the gathering in the particular manner of a person who is watching something with complete attention and not performing anything at all. He looked back at her with the quality of attention he always paid her, which was the measuring attention of someone who has found something important and is working out what to do about it. It was not the evening, she decided, for understanding what that meant. She put her copies of the framework back in her portfolio and went to answer Sir Geoffrey's follow-up question about the shared drainage costs. The formal inquiry came in December. The occasion was not of her making. It emerged from a complaint filed with the County Drainage Authority, one of the older landowners in the district, a man named Felton who controlled the upper reach of the shared drainage system, had contested the revised cost-sharing agreement she and Reese had negotiated in October, claiming that the Vane estate had no legal standing to renegotiate a boundary agreement without the involvement of the full drainage consortium. The claim was procedurally obscure and substantively weak, but it had triggered a formal review process that required a hearing before the County Authorities Committee in Harrogate. Mr. Penworth had told her about it on a Tuesday morning with the particular manner of a man delivering news he has already analyzed and found manageable. He said the hearing was in 3 weeks. He said she would need to present her case in person. He said that Reese Caddock would attend as the Ashwell party to the agreement, and that the County Authority Committee had the authority to ratify or overturn the revised agreement. She spent 10 days preparing. The preparation was the kind of work she had been doing in one form or another for 7 years, which was the sustained, systematic work of building an argument from documented evidence until the argument was not an argument at all, but a fact that had been organized into visible form. She had the original 1817 agreement. She had the maintenance records going back to that date, which she had obtained from the County Drainage Authority's own archive through Mr. Penworth. She had the revised agreement and the supporting cost-share analysis. She had, additionally, a comparative study of similar drainage consortium agreements in 3 adjacent counties, which she had prepared in the evenings with Mr. Penworth's assistance, that demonstrated the revised terms were entirely consistent with established practice. She organized this material into 7 sections, tabulated and cross-referenced. The morning before the hearing, she was at the estate office at Vane Cottage working through the final section when she heard a knock and found Reese Caddock at the door for only the second time. He had ridden over from Ashwell Park, apparently, because he was in riding clothes and there was mud on his boots. He said he had come to tell her that Sir Geoffrey Aske had sent him a note that morning indicating that he intended to appear at the hearing, not as a party to the dispute, but as a witness to the quality of the maintenance analysis, which he considered relevant to the committee's understanding of the dispute's context. She looked at him. Sir Geoffrey is attending on our behalf. He is attending on the behalf of the drainage framework, Reese said, which is, I believe, a distinction he is comfortable with. She said, that is useful. Yes, he said. He did not move from the doorway. The morning light was very flat and clear, the kind of light Yorkshire produces occasionally in December as a reminder that it is capable of it. I wanted to ask you something. She waited. When this is resolved, he said, when the hearing is done and the inheritance condition is satisfied in April, what were you planning to do? She was very still. Return to Bristol, I had assumed. Had assumed, he said, or intend. She looked at him for a long moment. I have not decided yet, she said. He nodded once, which was not a response so much as a receipt of information. He said he would see her at the hearing, and left. She stood at the cottage door after he had gone, and understood something she had been organizing around the edges of for 6 weeks. She had not thought about Bristol once in the previous 3 weeks. She had been thinking about the valley, about the tenant farms, about the drainage framework, about the Ashwell estate office and the ledgers on the desk, and a man who stood at the edge of social gatherings and looked at what was actually happening rather than what was being performed. She went back inside and finished the final section of her presentation. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. The County Drainage Authority Committee met in a long room in the Harrogate Courthouse on a Thursday morning in December with the particular seriousness of a body that takes its procedural role with genuine gravity. There were 5 committee members. There was a clerk. There was a room full of interested parties, including Mr. Felton and his solicitor, Mr. Penworth, Hargreaves, Sir Geoffrey Aske, and, at the back of the room in a dark coat, with the quality of someone who has arrived before anyone else and does not intend to be the center of attention, Rhys Caddock, Duke of Ashwell. Georgiana stood at the front of the room when her time came, with her 7 sections in the portfolio before her, and presented. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented. Section 1 was the original 1817 agreement with the relevant clauses identified. Section 2 was the maintenance record from 1817 to the current date, drawn from the county authority's own archive, with the cost share calculation performed in 2 independent ways that reached the same conclusion. Section 3 was the legal standing analysis, Mr. Penworth's work, and it was thorough, demonstrating that the Vane estate had full standing to negotiate the revised agreement under the terms of the original document. Sections 4 through 6 were the comparative analysis from adjacent counties and the practical implementation framework. Section 7 was 1 page, a summary of the annual drainage maintenance cost across the shared system before and after the revision, showing a total saving to all parties in the consortium of £68 annually, including a benefit to Mr. Felton's own property that she had highlighted in a separate row. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when something has been made impossible to contest. Mr. Felton's solicitor asked 3 questions. She answered 2 of them from the maintenance record and referred the third to Mr. Penworth, who answered it in 12 words. Sir Geoffrey rose from his seat without being invited and said that in his 30 years of dealing with this valley's drainage infrastructure, the analysis he had reviewed was the most comprehensive and well-documented case for a maintenance revision he had encountered, and that the committee would be well served by ratifying the agreement. He sat back down. The committee chair, a man named Barrows, who had the bearing of someone who has made decisions based on evidence for many years and is grateful when the evidence is organized, said the committee would retire to consider. They returned in 18 minutes. The revised agreement was ratified in its entirety. The room moved with the particular quality of rooms in which a thing has been decided. She gathered her papers with the same efficiency with which she had set them out, and put them in the portfolio, and straightened her back and turned. Rhys Caddock was standing in the center of the room, not at the back where he had been. He had moved at some point during the proceedings, and she had not noticed when, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could read now. She had learned to read it over 6 weeks, had learned the specific quality of his attention, the way it was different from observation and different from admiration, and was actually something older and quieter than either of those, which was recognition. He crossed the room toward her in the manner of someone who has already decided what he is going to do. He took her gloved hand in both of his and bowed over it. Not the perfunctory bow of a duke acknowledging a professional associate, but a genuine, deliberate bow, a bow that had meaning beyond its form, and he held the bow long enough that every person in that room understood what it signified. He raised his head and looked at her. "Miss Vane," he said, and his voice carried in the room because he made no effort to lower it. "You have just done, in 30 minutes, what this valley's drainage authorities have been incapable of doing in 20 years. The evidence was always there," she said. "It required organizing." "Yes," he said. He did not release her hand. "It did." The room was watching. Mr. Penworth was watching with the expression of a man who has suspected for some time that a thing was going to happen and is gratified to have been right. Hargreaves was watching with the expression of a man who has known his employer well enough for 8 months to recognize this moment. Sir Geoffrey Aske was watching with the expression of a man who is recalibrating, not with warmth, not entirely, but with the particular quality of recalibration that cannot be accomplished in a single morning and does not pretend to be. He released her hand. The bow had made its statement. The room had registered it. She looked at him and said, "Your Grace, You have mud on your boot still. The left one." He looked down. Then he looked at her, and something in his face shifted that was not the professional reserve and was not the contained authority, but was something she had only glimpsed once before, in the estate office when she had straightened the cravat, the quality of a man who has been isolated for a long time and has just found the particular company that makes him less so. "I rode over from Ashwell at 7 o'clock, he said. "I know," she said. "I heard the horse go past the cottage." He had come 3 miles in December mud to sit at the back of a room and watch her work. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue, but she understood now, looking at him in this room with the drainage authority document ratified and the evidence organized and 30 witnesses arranged around them, that this was not rescue. This was recognition. It was different in kind and older and considerably more useful. She gathered her portfolio and they walked out of the courthouse together, and the December light in Harrogate was the flat, clear kind that makes the stone buildings look like they have been there forever and intend to continue. He proposed the first time on the road back to the valley, which was not precisely the romantic occasion of any woman's imagination, but was entirely consistent with who they both were. He said, in the direct manner he used for contracts and drainage agreements and everything else that mattered to him, that he believed the inheritance condition and the consultancy engagement were both going to expire in April, and that he did not wish either of them to result in her departure from the valley, and that the most appropriate solution to this, which was also the solution he wanted with a certainty he had not previously experienced about anything that was not evidential, was marriage, if she was willing. She said that she would need to think about it. He said that was reasonable. He said he had the 1817 drainage agreement in his estate office if she needed it for reference. She said that was not what she was going to think about. He said he knew that. There was a quality in his voice that was the closest thing to warmth she had heard from him in 6 weeks of professional meetings, which was to say that it was understated and completely genuine. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about Bristol and about 43 pounds saved and accounts kept for a firm that would survive perfectly well without her. She thought about Vane Cottage and the 2 tenant farms and the drainage framework and the Ashwell estate office with the ledgers on the desk. She thought about her father's will and its structured way of bringing her back to a valley she had thought she was finished with. She thought about the kind of visibility that was not performed and not social but was simply the attention of a person who sees what is actually there. She thought about the fact that she had straightened his cravat in the estate office and he had not moved and had not said a word, and about the fact that he had ridden 3 miles through December mud to sit at the back of a room and watch her present. On the 4th evening she rode to Ashwell Park and asked to see the Duke. He received her in the estate office, which was where she had expected him to be, with papers on the desk and a fire in the grate and the ledgers still in their place. His mother's accounts, the record of 30 years of invisible labor that had built this estate, kept on the working desk rather than filed away. She understood, seeing them again, that they were not simply records. They were the reason he had looked at her the way he looked at her from the beginning. "I have thought about it," she said. He stood up from the desk. He crossed the room and he did not maintain the professional distance of 6 weeks of boundary markers and estate office meetings. He stood close enough that she could have straightened his cravat again, which was, as far as she could tell, straight, because she had straightened it once, and apparently it had taken. "I need to tell you something first," he said. "Not because it is expedient or because it solves the structural problem of the inheritance condition and the consultancy agreement and the April deadline. Because it is true." He paused. "I have been watching you work in this valley for 6 weeks, and I have understood, progressively, what it means that you left it 4 years ago, and I did not, could not, stop you. I did not know you well enough to stop you. I know you now. I am not going to not say this on the grounds that it is inconvenient." Another pause. I want the specific life that includes you, the accounts, the drainage framework, the tenant farms, the arguments about methodology, the mud on my boots and you noticing. I want all of it." She looked at him for the length of time it took to be certain, which was not very long, because the certainty had been organizing itself for 6 weeks and had simply been waiting for the right moment to present its conclusions. "Yes," she said. He put his hand against her face with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And then he kissed her, and the estate office was very quiet around them in the way that rooms are quiet when something that has been building for a long time finally arrives. They were married in February in the Ashwell Chapel by the same vicar who had buried both their fathers, in a service attended by Hargreaves and Mrs. Anstey and Thomas Anwick from Mallow Farm, and Mr. Penworth and a young woman named Clara Toft, who had come from the Ridge Farm and had been Georgiana's first genuine friend in the valley, direct and warmly indignant and entirely clear-sighted from the morning she had arrived at the cottage door with a parcel of eggs, and said that anyone who could renegotiate the Mallow Farm lease in 3 weeks deserved eggs. Clara sat in the front row of the chapel and cried without apology, which was entirely in character. The Vane Cottage farms were managed within the Ashwell estate framework after the marriage, which meant that the maintenance schedule Georgiana had designed for both properties was administered under a single coherent system. The £41 of recovered annual margin from the Vane tenants' revised leases were reinvested in the Mallow farmhouse roof and the north barn equipment in the first spring. The drainage framework she had developed was adopted formally by the County Drainage Authorities Consortium the following September, after Sir Geoffrey Aske, who had, over the course of several months, arrived at the particular recalibration of a man who has examined his assumptions and found them insufficient, endorsed it at the annual landowners' meeting, and attributed it, by name, to the Duchess of Ashwell. Mr. Penworth, who attended that meeting, wrote her a letter afterward that contained, in its final paragraph, the observation that her father had always believed she would eventually have an appropriate audience for her talents, and that it appeared he had been right, as he generally was about things that required patience. She had, in the months following the marriage, developed the maintenance framework into a 38-page annotated document, methodology, cost projections, implementation guidance, case studies from the Ashwell and Vane farms, that she circulated through Mr. Penworth to the solicitors and stewards of 6 neighboring estates. 3 of them implemented it within 2 years. A 4th sent her a letter with questions that generated a correspondence lasting 18 months, and eventually a revised and expanded 2nd edition that Mr. Penworth had privately printed and bound in modest editions for professional distribution. She had not transformed. She was not the person she had become. She was the person she had always been, doing the work she had always done, in a world that had finally provided the conditions under which that work was visible. Their daughter was born in January of the following year, Eleanor Vane Caddick, named for the woman whose ledgers still sat on the estate office desk. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular quality of attention, observable even at 4 months, when she fixed people with a gaze that suggested she was collecting information. Rees said that this was alarming and that he was very pleased. He was in the habit of watching Georgiana work, in the mornings when the light came through the estate office windows, and she was at the desk with the accounts, and Eleanor was in the perambulator beside her, occasionally attempting to escape it with the organized determination of someone who has identified a structural problem and is working on a solution. He watched her from the doorway. She knew he was there. She had known for approximately 4 minutes, because his boots made a particular sound on the flagstone floor of the corridor, and she had learned the sound the way she had learned every operational detail of this estate, completely. She did not look up immediately. She made a notation in the current column and wrote the reference in the margin, and then set the pen down and looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with the quiet, contained warmth of a man who has found his place in the world and is making no effort to conceal his satisfaction with it. "The Phase 2 drainage review," she said, "is on the left side of the desk." "I know," he said. "I have been reading it for 3 days." "And," she said. "And," he said, "it is, as everything you have written is, completely correct and considerably better than anything I would have produced." "Good," she said. "Sign it and I'll send it to Penworth." Eleanor made a sound from the perambulator that suggested her analysis of the situation was complete and she would be requiring assistance in escaping it. Reese crossed the room, because he always crossed the room, and lifted his daughter with the unhurried competence of a man who has learned this skill as thoroughly as he has learned everything he has needed to learn for the people he loves. He stood beside the desk with Eleanor against his shoulder, and she put her small hand against his coat in the particular way she had, which was the way of someone who is entirely certain of their welcome. The estate office was warm. The December light was coming through the windows in the flat, clear way that Yorkshire manages sometimes as a gift. The Phase 2 drainage review was on the left side of the desk, correctly cited and thoroughly annotated, waiting to go to Mr. Penworth. Georgiana picked up her pen and returned to the accounts. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work, and this was what it had built, a life that was entirely, precisely, hers.